Picture this. It's 1924 in Miami. The morning sun beats down on dirt roads that just last year were empty stretches of swampland. But now there are men in linen suits standing in the heat, clutching handwritten contracts, their eyes bright with possibility. They've come from Chicago and Detroit, from Philadelphia and New York. They've left behind the snow and the factories and the grey winter skies. And they're here, and what someone has promised them is paradise. This is the story of the Florida land boom, America's first great real estate bubble, a time when ordinary people believed they could buy a piece of heaven and sell it for a fortune. But let's begin earlier, much earlier, before the boom, before the bubble, before the crash that would echo through history. Let's begin with a railroad man named Henry Flagler and his impossible dream of connecting the world to a wilderness. In 1894, Flagler's railroad finally reached West Palm Beach. The sound of the locomotive whistle echoed across sawgrass and cypress swamps. This was the edge of everything. Beyond lay the Everglades, vast, impenetrable, mysterious. The train carried more than passengers. It carried possibility. For the first time, wealthy northerners could escape winter, not by sailing to Europe, but by riding the rails to Florida. 2 years later, the railroad pushed further south. It reached a small settlement called Miami. Miami in 1896 was barely a town. A few wooden buildings, a trading post. Mangrove trees grew right to the water's edge. Alligators sunned themselves on muddy banks. The population, maybe 300 souls. But Henry Flagler saw something else. He saw hotels rising from the jungle. He saw winter visitors filling train cars. He saw fortunes waiting in the swampland. Then came 1912, and Flagler's most audacious gamble of all. His railroad would not stop at Miami. It would leap across the ocean itself, island by island, all the way to Key West. They called it Flagler's Folly. Engineers said it couldn't be done. The ocean was too wild, the storms too fierce. But mile by mile, bridge by bridge, the railroad crept across the water. When it was finished, when the first train rolled into Key West, Florida was no longer the edge of America. It was the gateway to the Caribbean, the doorway to paradise. But even then, in 1912, Florida remained a quiet place, a winter destination for the wealthy, a curiosity for the adventurous. The great boom was still nearly a decade away, waiting for the perfect storm of circumstance to set it in motion. And that storm was about to begin. The year was 1914. Across the Atlantic, Europe was tearing itself apart. The Great War had begun, and suddenly, wealthy Americans could no longer spend their winters on the French Riviera. The Mediterranean was a war zone now. The grand hotels of Nice and Cannes had closed their doors. Where could they go instead? Where could they find that same tropical warmth, that same sense of escape from the industrial north? Florida, someone whispered. Florida has palm trees. Florida has sunshine. Florida might just be America's own Riviera. At the same time, something else was happening, something that would transform the very landscape of South Florida. Engineers had begun draining the Everglades. Mile by mile, they carved canals through the sawgrass. They built dikes and levees. They turned wetlands into dry land. Suddenly, there was space, vast, empty space, where alligators had once swum and herons had once nested. Space for development, space for dreams. By 1920, Florida's population had grown to nearly 1 million people. Miami was no longer a frontier outpost. It was becoming something new, something that had never existed before in America. A tropical city. The year 1921 arrived quietly. The war was over. America was entering what would be called the Roaring Twenties, and in South Florida, something began to stir. Land prices started to rise, not dramatically at first, just steadily. A lot that had sold for $1,000 suddenly cost $1,500, then $2,000, then $3,000. Word spread slowly at first. In the hotels and country clubs of the North, someone would mention it over brandy and cigars. "I bought a little piece of land down in Florida," they'd say casually. "Made a tidy profit when I sold it." Others began to listen. Others began to wonder. But the real story, the story that would change everything, begins with a man named Carl Fisher, an Indiana automobile pioneer who had already made one fortune and was about to make another. Carl Fisher was not a subtle man. He had helped build the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He had co-founded what would become the Preston Tucker Automobile Company. He believed in publicity, grand gestures, impossible dreams. And when he looked at Miami Beach in the early 1920s, he saw his greatest publicity stunt yet. Miami Beach was barely an island then, more of a mangrove swamp surrounded by water. But Fisher saw hotels, golf courses, a tropical paradise that would make the French Riviera seem ordinary. He began buying land, acre after acre of swamp and sand. And then he began his campaign. In Times Square, in the heart of New York City, Carl Fisher erected a billboard, a massive sign that could be seen for blocks. And on that sign, in letters 20 feet tall, was a message that would echo through the decade. "It's June in Miami. It's June in Miami." While New Yorkers shivered in winter coats, while Chicagoans battled blizzards, while the industrial cities of the North disappeared under snow and ice, it was June in Miami. The message was simple, irresistible. Eternal summer was waiting, just a train ride away. By 1924, the trickle had become a flood. Every day, trains arrived in Miami packed with investors. Men in city suits who had never seen a palm tree. Women who had never felt sand between their toes. They came with checkbooks and dreams and absolute faith that Florida real estate could only go up. And for a while, they were right. Lots that had sold for $2,000 in 1921 were selling for $20,000 in 1924. Then $50,000, then $100,000. The numbers had stopped making sense. But no one seemed to care. This was speculation on a scale America had never seen. People weren't buying land to build on. They weren't buying homes to live in. They were buying paper contracts, betting that someone else would pay even more tomorrow. And someone always did. New cities began to appear overnight, not just neighborhoods, entire cities. Miami Beach, where Carl Fisher was building his tropical paradise. Coral Gables, designed to look like a Spanish villa. Hialeah, Miami Springs, Opa-locka. Names that sounded exotic, foreign, magical. Each city came with its own story, its own promise. Opa-locka would look like something from the Arabian Nights, complete with minarets and domes. Coral Gables would have canals like Venice, but with better weather. Miami Beach would be, well, Miami Beach would be perfect. The developers hired armies of salesmen. They dressed them in white suits and gave them silver tongues. They trained them to paint pictures with words, to make swampland sound like paradise. "Imagine," the salesman would say, "waking up every morning to sunshine. Imagine never shoveling snow again. Imagine watching your investment double, triple, in just a few months." And people imagined and people believed, and people bought. The boom created its own strange economy. Entire industries sprang up overnight. Office buildings filled with real estate companies. Hotels filled with land speculators. Restaurants served breakfast to men who would make fortunes before dinner. In 1925, Florida passed new laws requiring real estate salesmen to have licenses. The law was meant to bring order to the chaos, but instead it just created more chaos. Suddenly everyone needed an office. Office space became as scarce as beachfront property. The railroads strained under the load. Freight cars packed with building materials stretched for miles. Lumber, cement, steel, plumbing fixtures. Everything needed to build new cities in the middle of nowhere. The trains could barely keep up. And still the buyers came, and still the prices rose. But not everyone was caught up in the fever. Some watched from the sidelines with growing concern. Newspaper editors began writing cautionary articles. Government officials started asking questions. The Internal Revenue Service launched investigations. They wanted to understand how paper profits were being taxed, how fortunes made on nothing but speculation could be real. A few brave reporters traveled to Florida to see the boom for themselves. What they found was complicated. Yes, there was real development. Hotels were being built. Golf courses were being carved out of palmetto scrub. Some of the new cities were actually cities. But there were also ghost subdivisions, lots marked out with wooden stakes in the middle of swampland, streets that existed only on paper, cities that were nothing more than surveyors' marks in the mud. One reporter wrote that land prices were based not on actual value, but on the expectation of finding a customer. As long as someone believed they could sell for more tomorrow, the boom would continue. But what would happen when tomorrow came? Let's pause here and visit one particular development, one that captures both the ambition and the absurdity of the Florida boom, a place called Flagler City. In January of 1926, the Flagler Tribune announced that ground had been broken for a $20 million project. $20 million. An enormous sum in an era when a new car cost $500. Flagler City would stretch for 4 miles along the Dixie Highway, halfway between St. Augustine and Daytona Beach. It would have streets and curbing and sidewalks, a gas station for the automobile tourists, a construction camp for 200 workers. And at its heart, a 120-acre model farm. The farm was the brainchild of a man named K.W. Lord, a former county agricultural agent. He envisioned something that had never been tried before, a working farm that would demonstrate the agricultural possibilities of Florida to potential buyers. There would be a Guernsey dairy herd, 2,000 chickens, crops growing year-round in the eternal Florida sunshine. Visitors could see with their own eyes how their investment in little farms could pay dividends forever. Philadelphia bankers backed the project. Surveyors mapped the land. Workers poured concrete for curbing. The model farm took shape, complete with barns and chicken coops and a proper dairy. For a few months, Flagler City existed. Not as a city, not quite yet, but as a possibility. A $20 million possibility stretching along the highway. Then, the ads stopped appearing in the newspapers. The construction workers went home. The Philadelphia bankers stopped taking calls. The Guernsey cows were sold to other farms. All that remained of Flagler City was 4 miles of concrete curbing, an outline of a dream that had lasted less than a year. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In early 1926, Flagler City still seemed possible. The boom was still booming. The prices were still rising. And then, on January 10th, 1926, disaster struck. A 241-foot schooner called the Prince Valdemar was being towed into Miami Harbor. The ship was destined to become a floating hotel, another attraction for the tourists flocking to paradise. But something went wrong. The ship began to list. Water poured into the hull, and slowly, majestically, inevitably, the Prince Valdemar rolled over and sank. Right in the mouth of Miami Harbor. Suddenly, no ships could enter or leave Miami's port. Cargo vessels loaded with construction materials sat anchored offshore, unable to unload. Supply ships carrying food and fuel waited helplessly in the Atlantic swells. Miami Beach was an island, and now it was truly isolated. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. A ship bound for glory, sunk by its own ambitions, a harbor blocked by the very dreams it was meant to serve. The newspapers had a field day. "Paradise lost," one headline read. "Dreams sink in Miami Harbor," declared another. For the first time since the boom began, the magic seemed fragile. But the real problems were just beginning. By October of 1925, the railroad system was in crisis. The three major railroads serving Florida, the Seaboard Airline, the Florida East Coast, and the Atlantic Coastline, made an unprecedented decision. They imposed an embargo. No more freight cars loaded with non-essential materials would be allowed into Florida. The system was completely gridlocked. Imagine the scene. Miles and miles of freight trains stretched across Florida. Lumber cars, cement cars, cars loaded with bathroom fixtures and window glass and roofing tiles, all of it sitting motionless under the Florida sun. Construction stopped, not gradually, but all at once. Half-built hotels stood like concrete skeletons. Streets remained unpaved. The great building boom of South Florida simply froze. And in that frozen moment, people began to think. They began to ask uncomfortable questions. If the railroads couldn't deliver materials, how would the new cities ever be finished? If hotels couldn't be completed, who would fill all those residential lots? If the infrastructure couldn't support what was already planned, how could prices keep rising? For the first time in 5 years, doubt crept into the Florida dream. The railroads lifted their embargo in May of 1926. Materials began flowing again. Construction crews returned to work. But something had changed. The speculators who had been so confident, so eager to buy, now found themselves in an unfamiliar position. They owned contracts for lots in developments that might never be finished. They held paper promises for cities that might never exist. And for the first time, they couldn't find anyone willing to buy those promises for more than they had paid. The greater fool theory, the idea that there would always be someone willing to pay a higher price, was breaking down. Panic started slowly. A few investors tried to sell, then a few more. Then suddenly everyone was trying to sell, and no one was buying. Bank deposits that had grown steadily through the boom years began to shrink. Smaller banks, the ones that had made the most aggressive loans on Florida real estate, started to worry. They began calling in loans. They began demanding immediate payment. But payment was impossible. The money had never been real. It had been made of hope and sunshine and the belief that palm trees could grow fortunes. And then, on September 18th, 1926, nature delivered the final blow. The Great Miami Hurricane of 1926 was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Winds of 150 miles per hour, a storm surge that turned downtown Miami into a lake. The hurricane arrived at night. People woke to the sound of their roofs being torn away. Palm trees that had been planted to create tropical paradise snapped like matchsticks. The grand hotels that were supposed to rival the French Riviera collapsed into rubble. Miami Beach, Carl Fisher's tropical paradise, was devastated. The golf courses were underwater. The grand boulevards were rivers. The luxury hotels were shells. But the hurricane did more than destroy buildings. It destroyed the illusion. Here was paradise, revealed as a place where nature could kill without warning. Here was tropical bliss, shown to be a hurricane zone. Here was the land of eternal summer, proven to be a place where summer could turn deadly. Whatever public enthusiasm remained for Florida real estate died with that storm. The collapse was swift and total. Developments that had sold millions of dollars worth of lots were abandoned overnight. The grand cities that were supposed to rival Venice and Monte Carlo became ghost towns. Flagler City's concrete curbing lay empty under the Florida sun, a 4-mile monument to misplaced dreams. Aladdin City, Boca Raton, Chevalier, Fulford by the Sea, names that had once sounded magical now appeared only on old survey maps. The banks began to fail, not the big national banks, but the small local institutions that had bet everything on Florida dirt. Depositors lined up to withdraw their savings, but the savings were gone, invested in lots that were now worthless. Carl Fisher, the man who had promised that it was always June in Miami, watched his empire crumble. The Times Square billboard came down. The publicity machine fell silent. Fisher himself would struggle financially for the rest of his life, dying in 1939, a forgotten dreamer. And still the disasters came. In 1928, another hurricane struck. The Okeechobee hurricane was even deadlier than the Miami storm. It bankrupted the developers, who had somehow survived the first collapse. It flooded the areas that had been reclaimed from the Everglades, reminding everyone that nature doesn't recognize human property lines. Then came 1929, the Wall Street crash, the beginning of the Great Depression. Any hope of recovery for Florida real estate vanished with the stock market. In the years that followed, investigators would try to understand what had happened. How had an entire state fallen under the spell of a real estate bubble? How had rational people convinced themselves that swampland was worth its weight in gold? The answers were complex. The boom had been fueled by genuine changes. The railroad connections, the drainage of the Everglades, the shift of wealthy tourism from Europe to America. But it had been sustained by something else entirely, by the belief that prices would always rise, by the faith that there would always be someone willing to pay more, by the dream that paradise could be bought and sold. Governor Doyle Carleton, elected in 1928 as the bust deepened, tried to clean up the mess. He pushed for limits on local government debt, trying to prevent counties from borrowing their way out of the crisis they had borrowed their way into. But northern Florida legislators opposed him. They didn't want their tax money used to bail out the southern counties that had gone mad with speculation. The political battles were as bitter as the financial collapse. Slowly, very slowly, Florida began to rebuild. Not the fantastic cities that had been planned, but real places where real people could live real lives. Some of the boomtowns survived and thrived. Miami became a major American city. Miami Beach, despite Carl Fisher's bankruptcy, evolved into an international destination. Coral Gables preserved its Mediterranean architecture and became one of Florida's most beautiful communities. But others vanished entirely. They exist now only in old photographs and survey maps. Ghost subdivisions in the Everglades, where alligators once again nest among the concrete foundations. The boom left other legacies too, darker legacies. Carl Fisher and other developers had included racial deed restrictions in their developments. African Americans were forbidden from buying property in the new paradise cities. These restrictions would endure for decades, shaping patterns of segregation that lasted long after the boom itself was forgotten. The dream of paradise, it turned out, was not for everyone. Looking back across nearly a century, the Florida land boom seems both distant and familiar. The specific details are exotic. The railroad embargoes, the schooner blocking the harbor, the concrete curbing stretching through empty swampland. But the pattern is timeless. Rising prices that seem to justify themselves. Ordinary people convinced they can get rich quick by buying and selling paper promises. Developers who build castles in the air and sell them as if they were made of stone. The belief that this time is different, that the new economy has changed the old rules, that prices can rise forever if only we believe hard enough. And then, the moment when belief is no longer enough. When the ships can't reach the harbor, when the trains can't deliver the materials, when the hurricanes remind everyone that nature doesn't care about property values. When paradise reveals itself to be just another place where humans try to build their dreams, and sometimes fail. The survivors of the Florida boom learned hard lessons. They learned that land is only worth what someone will pay for it. They learned that publicity can create demand, but can't create value. They learned that paradise, if it exists at all, can't be mass-produced and sold by the acre. Some learned to be more careful, more skeptical, more aware that every boom carries the seeds of its own bust. But others seemed to forget entirely. Within decades, new booms would sweep across America. New promises that land values could only go up. New dreams of getting rich quick on real estate speculation. The Florida land boom was America's first great property bubble, but it would not be the last. Even today, in the 21st century, Florida experiences wave after wave of real estate speculation. New migrants arrive from the north, drawn by the same promises of sunshine and prosperity that lured investors in 1924. New developments spring up in the wetlands. New cities are planned and marketed and sold before they're built. New fortunes are made and lost on the dream that paradise can be bought and sold. The names change, the technology improves, the scale grows larger. But the human heart remains the same, still hoping, still dreaming, still believing that somewhere, somehow, there's a place where it's always June, and the living is easy, and the money grows on palm trees. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can see them. The ghosts of Flagler City, walking along their 4 miles of concrete curbing. The phantom hotels of Miami Beach that were never built. The dream cities that exist now only in the soft space between waking and sleeping. They are not sad ghosts. They are the ghosts of hope, the ghosts of ambition, the ghosts of people who believed, perhaps too much, but who believed nonetheless. And maybe that's not such a bad way to be remembered, as people who dreamed too big rather than people who never dreamed at all. The sun sets over the Everglades now just as it did then. The palm trees sway in the ocean breeze. The water laps against the shore where railroads once ended and dreams once began. And somewhere in the distance, if you listen carefully, you might hear the whistle of a long-ago train, carrying hope and possibility and the unshakable belief that tomorrow will be better than today. That it's always June, somewhere. That paradise is always just one more mile down the track. The Florida land boom is over now. It ended almost a century ago in hurricanes and bankruptcies and the hard reality that paper dreams can't survive real storms. But the human story continues. In every generation, in every place, people search for their own version of paradise. Sometimes they find it, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they discover that paradise was where they started, not where they thought they were going. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the mind is still, paradise is simply the place where stories live, where the past speaks gently to the present, where the dreams of yesterday become the lullabies of tonight. Sweet dreams, from the land where it's always June. Sweet dreams, from paradise. The echoes of that distant train whistle fade now, but other sounds emerge from the Florida night, the gentle lapping of water against mangrove roots, the soft rustle of palm fronds in the evening breeze, the distant call of a night heron, returning to roost in places where, a century ago, men in linen suits once stood with blueprints and promises. Let us linger a while longer in this place between memory and sleep. There are more stories to tell, quieter stories, the human stories that lived within the great boom and survived its collapse. Stories of ordinary people who found themselves caught up in extraordinary times. Consider Sarah Matthews, a schoolteacher from Cleveland who saved $35 from her monthly salary through the winter of 1924. $35. Enough perhaps for a new dress or a week's vacation at a lake cottage in Ohio. But Sarah had been reading the newspapers. She had seen Carl Fisher's advertisements. She had heard her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, talking about the letter her brother had sent from Miami, describing lots that doubled in value every month. So Sarah took her $35 and bought a train ticket south. She arrived in Miami on a Tuesday morning in March. The sun was already warm at 9 o'clock, warmer than Cleveland had been all winter. Palm trees cast shadows on dirt roads. The air smelled of salt water and possibility. A young man in a white suit approached her at the station. His name was Jimmy Patterson, and he sold real estate for the Miracle Mile Development Company. He had kind eyes and a soft Georgia drawl, and he promised Sarah he could turn her life savings into something wonderful. He drove her in a Model T Ford out past the edge of the city, past the last paved road, past the last real houses, into an area that was still more wilderness than development. Here, he said, pointing to a stretch of scrubland dotted with wooden stakes, was where the future would rise. Imagine, Jimmy said, and Sarah tried to imagine. Swimming pools and tennis courts, a hotel right over there, shops and restaurants, all of it connected to Miami by a beautiful boulevard lined with royal palms. Sarah looked at the scrubland. She looked at the wooden stakes. She looked at Jimmy's earnest face. And she believed. She bought lot number 427 for $250, more money than she made in 3 months of teaching. Jimmy accepted a down payment of $50 and promised her she could pay the rest in monthly installments. By Christmas, he said, this lot will be worth $500, maybe more. Sarah returned to Cleveland with a deed in her purse and dreams in her heart. She would pay off the lot by Christmas. Then she would sell it and use the profits to buy another lot, then another. Within a few years, she might have enough money to stop teaching, to move to Florida permanently, to live where it was always June. For 8 months, Sarah sent $25 south every month. $25 that might have gone for better meals or warmer clothes or small luxuries. Instead, it went to lot number 427 in a development she had visited once and would never see again. By December of 1925, Sarah owned her lot free and clear. But when she wrote to Jimmy Patterson about selling it, her letters came back marked addressee unknown. When she called the Miracle Mile Development Company, the telephone operator told her the number was no longer in service. Lot number 427 still exists today. You can find it on old survey maps of Miami-Dade County. It's in what is now a nature preserve. Protected wetlands where herons fish and alligators sun themselves on fallen logs. Sarah never got her money back. She never saw her lot again. But sometimes, late at night, when the Ohio winter pressed cold against her windows, she would close her eyes and remember that warm March morning when anything seemed possible. She would remember the smell of salt air and the sound of Jimmy Patterson's voice painting pictures of swimming pools and royal palms. And maybe, just maybe, that memory was worth something too. Or consider Frank Delacroix, a retired steamship captain from New Orleans who had spent 40 years navigating the Gulf of Mexico. Frank knew weather, he knew storms, he knew the power of water and wind. But in 1925, Frank was 70 years old and tired of being careful. His shipping company pension would last his lifetime if he lived modestly. But Frank didn't want to live modestly. He wanted one last adventure. So he sold his house in the French Quarter and moved to Miami Beach. Not to speculate in real estate. Frank was too old and too wise for that. But to live in paradise while he still could. To wake up every morning to ocean breezes instead of Mississippi River fog. Frank rented a small apartment 6 blocks from the beach. He bought a wicker chair for his balcony and spent his mornings watching pelicans dive for fish. He learned the names of tropical flowers. He made friends with other retired men who gathered each afternoon to play dominoes in the park. For 18 months, Frank lived his version of the American dream. Not getting rich quick, but getting peaceful slow. Not buying paradise, but finding it in small daily pleasures. Then came the hurricane of 1926. Frank had weathered many storms at sea, but this one was different. This one came with nowhere to run. He spent that terrible night in the hallway of his apartment building, listening to the roof tear away piece by piece, listening to windows explode, listening to the ocean claim streets that had been dry land just hours before. When morning came, Frank's building was still standing. Barely. His apartment was destroyed. His wicker chair was somewhere in the Atlantic. His small savings were gone, not to speculation, but to the simple reality that paradise comes with a price. Frank could have returned to New Orleans. His old friends would have helped him start over, but he chose to stay in Miami Beach. He found work as a harbor pilot, guiding ships through channels he learned by heart during the long months of recovery. The storm was part of it, he would tell people years later. You can't have the beauty without the danger. You can't have paradise without hurricanes. The trick is knowing that, and choosing paradise anyway. Frank Delacroix died in 1943, still living 6 blocks from the beach, still watching pelicans dive for fish, still believing that some dreams are worth their true cost. And then there was Maria Santos, who came to Florida not as an investor, but as a worker. Maria's family had moved from Cuba to Key West in 1923, following the cigar industry that had relocated there decades earlier. When the land boom reached its peak, Maria was 19 years old and working as a seamstress in a Key West tobacco factory. She sent most of her wages home to her parents. She saved a few dollars each month toward a future she couldn't quite imagine yet. But as the boom grew, labor became scarce throughout South Florida. Construction companies sent recruiters to Key West, promising good wages for anyone willing to work on the new developments. Maria's supervisor at the tobacco factory suggested she might make more money sewing curtains and cushions for the luxury hotels rising from Miami Beach to Palm Beach. So Maria took a job with a Miami decorator. For 2 years, she sewed silk drapes for hotel lobbies that would never open. She upholstered furniture for apartments that would never be furnished. She hemmed linens for restaurants that would never serve their first meal. She worked in a small workshop with 7 other seamstresses, women from Cuba and Haiti and the Bahamas who had come to Florida for the same reason people had always come to America. Not to get rich quick, but to work hard and build better lives for their families. They were paid every Friday in cash. They sent money home to parents and grandparents and younger siblings. They rented small rooms in Miami's Cuban neighborhood and cooked black beans and rice on hot plates and dreamed of saving enough to bring their families north. When the boom collapsed, Maria's job disappeared overnight. The decorator closed his shop. The hotels cancelled their orders. The luxury apartments stood empty and unfinished. But Maria didn't go home to Key West. She stayed in Miami and found work in a laundry, then in a restaurant kitchen, then cleaning houses for the few wealthy families who had survived the crash with their fortunes intact. She married a man named Roberto, who worked construction, building the smaller, more practical buildings that replaced the fantastic dreams of the boom years. They had 3 children. They saved money slowly and carefully and bought a small house in 1938, paying cash because they had learned to distrust debt and speculation and promises of easy money. Maria lived in that house for 62 years. She watched Miami grow from a boom town to a real city. She saw her children graduate from high school and college. She saw her grandchildren learn to swim in the same ocean where Carl Fisher had once promised eternal June. And sometimes, in her later years, Maria would remember those 2 frantic years of sewing curtains for hotels that never opened. She would smile and shake her head at the strangeness of it all. But she never regretted staying in Florida. Because for Maria, the boom and bust had been just the backdrop to something more important. The slow, steady work of building a real life in a real place, where it happened to be sunny most of the time. These smaller stories, these quieter lives, they remind us that the Great Bubble was more than just numbers and newspaper headlines. It was thousands of individual choices, thousands of personal dreams, thousands of people trying to navigate between hope and fear, between prudence and possibility. Some, like Sarah Matthews, lost their savings but kept their memories. Others, like Frank Delacroix, found that paradise came with unexpected costs and chose it anyway. Still others, like Maria Santos, discovered that the real opportunity wasn't in speculating on dreams, but in doing the practical work that dreams require. All of them were part of the story. All of them helped create the strange, exuberant, ultimately fragile world of the Florida land boom. But there were other participants in this story too. Participants who couldn't buy or sell land, who couldn't ride the trains south from northern cities, who couldn't choose whether to speculate or not. The natural world of South Florida was being transformed by all this human ambition. And like the human participants, it had its own story to tell. The Everglades, that vast river of grass that had covered much of South Florida for thousands of years, was being systematically drained and divided. Each new canal was a victory for development and a loss for something much older. Alligators found their ancient nesting grounds replaced by surveyors' stakes. Wading birds discovered that their feeding areas had become construction sites. The subtle network of water flow that had sustained this ecosystem for millennia was being channeled and controlled and redirected toward human purposes. Some of this change was inevitable. Humans have always modified their environments. Cities have always grown at the expense of wilderness. But the speed of change during the boom years was unlike anything the natural world had experienced. In just 5 years, an area larger than several eastern states was surveyed, platted, and marketed for development. Most of that development never happened. Most of those lots were never built upon. But the surveying process itself left marks on the landscape. Roads that led nowhere, drainage ditches that disrupted natural water flow, cleared areas that gradually reverted to different kinds of vegetation. The hurricanes of 1926 and 1928 were, in their way, the natural world's response to all this disruption. The storms didn't distinguish between sustainable development and speculative excess. They destroyed hotels and office buildings with the same indifferent force they had always brought to barrier islands and coastal forests. But the storms also revealed something important. They showed that some human constructions could survive natural disasters, and others couldn't. The buildings that were designed to work with Florida's climate and geography often weathered the storms better than those that tried to recreate northern architectural styles in a tropical environment. The developments that preserved natural drainage patterns flooded less than those that ignored the ancient flow of water across the land. The communities that maintained some connection to their natural surroundings recovered faster than those that had tried to completely replace nature with human artifice. In the years after the boom, these lessons would slowly be learned. Not completely, not perfectly, but gradually. Florida would continue to grow and change, but at a more measured pace, with more attention to the consequences of development, with more respect for the power of storms and tides and the subtle requirements of life in a place where nature is never far away. The other great participant in this story was time itself. The land boom lasted roughly 5 years, from 1921 to 1926, but its effects rippled outward across decades. The infrastructure built during the boom years, the roads and bridges and utility lines, formed the foundation for the South Florida that emerged during World War II and the decades that followed. The cities that were planned during the boom, even those that partially failed, established patterns of development that influenced growth for generations. The lessons learned during the crash, about speculation and regulation and the relationship between publicity and value, shaped American attitudes toward real estate for decades to come. And the people who lived through the boom, the buyers and sellers, the dreamers and skeptics, the winners and losers, they told their stories to their children and grandchildren. They passed down both the excitement of those wild years and the hard wisdom that came after. Some of those stories became cautionary tales. Never buy land you haven't seen became a common piece of family advice. Don't believe everything the salesman tells you. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. But other stories kept the dream alive. Stories about the time when anything seemed possible, when ordinary people could imagine themselves becoming wealthy, when the future seemed bright and warm and unlimited. Both kinds of stories were true. Both were necessary. The cautionary tales helped people avoid repeating the same mistakes. The hopeful stories helped them keep believing in the possibility of better tomorrows. And perhaps that balance, between caution and hope, between memory and imagination, is what allowed Florida to eventually become something real and sustainable, rather than just a series of boom and bust cycles. Let us visit one more place before our story winds toward its close. A place that exists today, that you could visit tomorrow if you chose, where the echoes of the land boom can still be felt. Coral Gables is one of the boom's great success stories. Planned by George Merrick during the height of the speculation, it was designed to look like a Mediterranean village, complete with plazas and fountains and buildings that seem to have been aging gracefully in the Spanish sun for centuries. Unlike many boom-era developments, Coral Gables was built with genuine care and attention to detail. Merrick insisted on quality materials and skilled craftsmanship. He hired architects who understood how to create beauty that would last. When the boom collapsed, Coral Gables survived, not unscathed. Merrick himself lost his fortune, and many planned sections were never built. But the core of the community was solid enough to weather the crash and the hurricanes and the depression that followed. Today, if you walk through Coral Gables in the early evening, you can still feel the ghost of George Merrick's vision. The coral stone buildings glow warm in the setting sun. The plazas are filled with the quiet conversations of people finishing their workday. The fountains still play, their water catching the last light. It's beautiful. It's peaceful. It feels both timeless and timely, rooted in the past but comfortable in the present. But if you look closely, you can also see the evidence of the boom years. Empty lots that were platted for mansions that were never built. Streets that end abruptly at the borders of developments that never materialized. Architectural details that speak of grander plans that were never completed. Coral Gables is a place where the dreams of the 1920s became partially real, where vision and speculation and genuine craft combined to create something that outlasted its own origins. It's a reminder that not all bubbles end in total disaster. Sometimes they leave behind fragments of beauty. Sometimes the dreams prove more durable than the economics that created them. And sometimes, just sometimes, paradise isn't something you buy or sell. It's something you build slowly and carefully and maintain with love across the generations. As we near the end of our journey through the Florida land boom, let us consider what this story means for us today. Not as a lesson in economics or a warning about speculation, though it is both of those things, but as a story about the human heart, about our endless capacity for hope, our willingness to believe in better tomorrows, our ability to create beauty and meaning even from our mistakes. The people who participated in the Florida land boom were not foolish. They were not greedy. They were not evil. They were people like us, people trying to make sense of a changing world, people hoping that their children would have better lives than they did, people believing that somewhere, somehow, there was a place where winter never came and dreams always came true. That hope was not misplaced, even when it was misdirected, even when it led to financial disaster, even when it created problems that took generations to solve. Because hope is what builds cities. Hope is what creates art. Hope is what drives us to try new things, to explore new places, to imagine new possibilities. The tragedy of the Florida land boom was not that people hoped for too much. It was that the economic and social systems of the time weren't able to channel that hope into sustainable forms. But we learned from that tragedy. We created better systems, better regulations, better ways of distinguishing between genuine opportunity and mere speculation. And Florida itself, eventually, became something like what the dreamers of the 1920s had imagined. A place where people from around the world could come to escape harsh winters and build new lives. A place where retirement could mean leisure and recreation rather than poverty and decline. A place where tropical beauty and modern convenience could coexist. Not paradise. Nothing human ever achieves that. But something good, something real, something that justified in the end the dreams that created it. The night air is growing cooler now. The sounds of the Florida darkness are settling into their ancient rhythms. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train sounds its horn, carrying cargo to cities that were once just names on a surveyor's map. The ghosts of the land boom are quiet tonight. Sarah Matthews sleeps peacefully in her Cleveland apartment, dreaming of warm March mornings and the salt smell of possibility. Frank Delacroix rocks gently in his wicker chair, watching eternal pelicans dive for eternal fish. Maria Santos hums a Cuban lullaby to grandchildren who will never know a world without air conditioning and hurricane warnings and flood insurance. And in Flagler City, along those 4 miles of concrete curbing, the night herons nest in mangroves that have reclaimed the spaces where model farms were once planned. The Guernsey cows are long gone, but their distant descendants still graze in pastures not far away. The Philadelphia banker's investment has become habitat for creatures that never heard of the stock market and never worried about property values. This too is a kind of success. This too is a way that dreams can come true, not as humans planned them, but as nature and time and the slow wisdom of experience reshape them into something sustainable. Something that can last. If you visit Florida today, you'll find traces of the land boom everywhere. Not just in the obvious places like Coral Gables or Miami Beach, but in the subtle patterns that still shape how cities grow and change. You'll see it in the way communities plan for hurricanes, acknowledging that paradise comes with natural risks that must be accepted rather than ignored. You'll see it in the preservation of wetlands and wildlife corridors, recognition that development must coexist with the natural systems that make life possible. You'll see it in the regulations that govern real estate sales, protections that exist because earlier generations learned hard lessons about the difference between marketing and truth. But you'll also see the continuing appeal of the original dream. Every year, thousands of people still move to Florida, seeking some version of what Carl Fisher promised with his Times Square billboard. Eternal June, tropical ease, freedom from the constraints and complications of wherever they came from. And every year, some of them find it. Not the fantasy version, not the impossibly perfect paradise that can be bought and sold, but the real thing, the actual place, where the sun shines most days and the ocean is always nearby and the palm trees really do sway in the evening breeze. Where winter, when it comes at all, is gentle and brief. Where it's possible to sit on a porch in January and listen to the night sounds of a world where things grow year-round. Where paradise isn't a destination you purchase, but a way of paying attention to the place where you are. The story of the Florida land boom is ending now, but it's ending the way the best stories do, not with a conclusion, but with an invitation. An invitation to remember that every place was once someone's dream. Every city was once someone's vision of what life could become. An invitation to hope, but to hope wisely, to dream, but to dream with our eyes open. An invitation to build, but to build things that can weather the storms. And an invitation to rest now, to let the warm night air carry away the excitement and anxiety of boom and bust alike, to find peace in the knowledge that human dreams, even when they fail, often leave something beautiful behind. The concrete curbing of Flagler City still stretches along the Dixie Highway, but now it's covered with Spanish moss and morning glories. Butterflies alight on surfaces that were once surveyed and platted and sold as the foundation of fortunes. The model farm is gone, but the land is still fertile. Different crops grow there now, wild ones planted by birds and wind and the patient work of time. And sometimes, if you know where to look, you can still find traces of the old dreams. A fragment of fancy stonework hidden in the palmetto scrub. A street sign that leads nowhere but hasn't been taken down yet. A section of ornate iron gate that once marked the entrance to a development that never developed. These aren't monuments to failure. They're reminders that human imagination is stronger than economics. That beauty can outlast the systems that created it. That dreams, even shattered dreams, can become part of the landscape, growing wild and strange and ultimately more interesting than anything their creators originally intended. Sleep now. Let the story settle into the quiet places of memory. Let the ghosts of the land boom, find their rest in the space between what was planned and what actually happened. Let the night sounds of Florida carry you toward dreams of your own. Dreams that are wiser, perhaps, for having learned from those who dreamed before. Dreams that know the difference between speculation and building, between buying paradise and creating it. Dreams that know it's always June, in the places where we choose to tend our gardens with patience and hope, and the long, slow work of love. Good night from the land of eternal summer. Good night from the place where the railroad ended and the dreams began. Good night from Florida, where the morning sun will rise again tomorrow over cities that were once just lines on a surveyor's map, and where the human story continues to unfold beneath palm trees that have learned to bend without breaking in the wind. Sleep well. The morning after a Florida land boom story should be told gently, like the sun rising over Biscayne Bay, casting long shadows across empty lots that once held such promise. There are other voices in this story we haven't heard yet. Quieter voices, the people who watched the boom from the margins, who lived through it without participating in it, who saw both its dreams and its contradictions with clearer eyes. Let us listen to them now. In a small house in Coconut Grove, an elderly Bahamian woman named Violet Thompson tended her garden through all the boom years. She had come to Florida in 1898, following her husband, who found work laying track for Henry Flagler's railroad. Violet had seen the wilderness become farmland, then farmland become suburbs, then suburbs become something she couldn't quite name. Every morning she watered her tomatoes and her okra and her small grove of avocado trees that her husband had planted from seeds brought from Nassau. From her back porch, Violet could see the construction cranes working on Miami Beach. She could hear the sounds of hammering and sawing and the shouts of work crews. She could smell the concrete dust carried on the ocean breeze. But in her garden, time moved differently. The tomatoes ripened when they were ready. The avocados fell when the season was right. The hibiscus flowers opened each morning and closed each evening, regardless of what the real estate speculators were doing across the bay. Violet's neighbors often asked her what she thought about all the excitement, about the rising land values and the new developments, and the promises that everyone would become wealthy. "I've seen promises before," Violet would say, her hands still working in the rich, dark soil. The earth keeps its promises better than people do. During the height of the boom, developers approached Violet several times about selling her modest lot. They offered her sums that seemed impossible, enough money to buy a mansion in one of the new subdivisions. But Violet always declined. Not because she didn't understand the money, she understood it perfectly, but because she understood something else too. "My husband's hands built this house," she would explain. "His hands planted these trees. My children learned to walk in this garden. You can't put a price on that. You can't sell it and buy it somewhere else." When the boom collapsed, when her neighbors lost their investments, and the construction noise fell silent, Violet continued tending her garden. The tomatoes still needed water. The avocados still needed harvesting. The work of life continued regardless of what happened in the newspapers and the banks. And slowly, gradually, her neighbors began to understand what Violet had known all along. That wealth isn't just about money. That home isn't just about property values. That paradise isn't something you purchase from a salesman in a white suit. It's something you cultivate, day by day, season by season, with your own hands and your own heart. There was also Thomas Morrison, a fishing guide who worked the waters around the Florida Keys during the boom years. Thomas had been born in Key West in 1885, when the town was closer to Havana than to any mainland American city. His living came from the sea. Every morning before dawn, he would load his small boat with tackle and bait and meet wealthy tourists who wanted to catch tarpon and bonefish in the clear, shallow waters of the backcountry. Thomas knew every channel and every flat. He knew where the fish fed at different tides, which way the wind would blow based on the color of the sunrise, how to read the subtle signs that meant a storm was building beyond the horizon. During the boom years, his business grew along with everything else. More tourists meant more fishing parties. The new railroad connection to Key West brought sportsmen from New York and Chicago who had never seen water so clear they could count the scales on a fish 20 feet down. But Thomas noticed other changes too, changes that worried him. The mangrove creeks where he had learned to fish as a boy were being filled in for development. The grass flats where bonefish had fed for centuries were being dredged for boat channels. The pristine waters that drew tourists in the first place were slowly being altered by the very development their tourist dollars supported. "They're killing the thing they came to see," Thomas would tell his wife on those evenings when he returned from guiding men who talked endlessly about property values and investment opportunities while fish swam unnoticed beneath their boat. Thomas never bought land during the boom, not because he couldn't afford it. His guiding business was profitable, but because he had seen what happened when people tried to improve on what nature had already perfected. When the hurricanes came, Thomas's boat survived because he knew how to read the signs of coming weather. When the bust followed, his business survived because the fish didn't care about stock prices or real estate values. And in the years after the collapse, when Florida was slowly rebuilding its economy and its reputation, Thomas became something of a philosopher among the guides and fishermen who worked the waters around Key West. "The ocean teaches you patience," he would say. "It teaches you to work with what's there instead of trying to change everything to suit yourself." Most of those land boom folks, they never learned that lesson. Thomas Morrison continued guiding fishermen until he was 78 years old. He died in 1963, on his boat, at sunset, after a day spent showing a young couple from Ohio how to read the water and understand the tides. His funeral was held on the dock where he had launched his boat for 50 years. Fishermen and guides came from all over South Florida to pay their respects to a man who had never owned more than a small house and a seaworthy boat, but who had understood something about wealth that the land boom speculators had missed entirely. Then there was Dr. Eleanor Hartwell, who arrived in Miami in 1923 to establish a medical practice. Dr. Hartwell was one of the first female physicians in South Florida, a rarity in an era when women doctors were rare anywhere. She had graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School and done her residency in Baltimore. She could have stayed in the established cities of the East Coast, where there were hospitals and colleagues and all the resources of modern medicine. But Eleanor was drawn to Florida by something different than real estate speculation. She was drawn by the opportunity to help build something genuinely new, to practice medicine in a place where there weren't enough doctors, where the growing population desperately needed health care. Eleanor opened her practice in a small office on Flagler Street, just as the boom was reaching its peak. Her first patients were construction workers injured on building sites. Then came the real estate agents suffering from stress and exhaustion. Then the investors who couldn't sleep at night, worried about their leveraged positions in developments they had never seen. Eleanor treated them all with the same careful attention. She listened to their symptoms and their stories. She prescribed rest for the sleepless and caution for the reckless. She delivered babies for families who had come to Florida seeking better lives. But Eleanor also saw the darker side of the boom years, the men who drank too much to cope with the pressure of constant speculation, the women who developed nervous conditions from the uncertainty of boom and bust economics, the children whose families moved constantly, chasing the next big opportunity, never putting down roots anywhere. When the boom collapsed, Eleanor's practice changed but didn't disappear. The construction workers were unemployed now, but they still got sick and injured. The real estate agents had lost their fortunes, but they still needed medical care. The investors who had been wealthy were now poor, but pneumonia and broken bones don't respect financial status. Eleanor adapted. She lowered her fees for patients who couldn't pay. She accepted payment in vegetables from patients who had returned to farming. She made house calls to families who couldn't afford to come to her office. And slowly, through the depression years that followed the bust, Eleanor helped build something that lasted longer than any real estate speculation. She helped build a community, a network of people who looked out for each other, who understood that real wealth comes from having neighbors you can count on when times get hard. Dr. Eleanor Hartwell practiced medicine in Miami for 42 years. She delivered over 3,000 babies. She treated hurricane victims and heart attacks and everything in between. When she finally retired in 1965, the city named a street after her. Eleanor Hartwell Avenue runs through a quiet residential neighborhood where families raise children and tend gardens and go about the ordinary business of living. It's not the most famous street in Miami. It's not lined with mansions or luxury hotels. But it's real. It's lasted. It represents something that no amount of speculation could create and no market crash could destroy. The simple human work of caring for each other. These quieter stories, these voices from the margins of the great boom, they remind us that history has layers, that behind every grand narrative of economic rise and fall, there are individual lives being lived with dignity and purpose. People like Violet Thompson and Thomas Morrison and Dr. Eleanor Hartwell weren't trying to get rich quick. They weren't buying paradise or selling dreams. They were doing something more modest and more profound. They were paying attention to what was actually in front of them, the soil that needed tending, the fish that needed finding, the patients who needed healing. They were building the foundation on which real communities rest, not the flashy superstructure of speculation and publicity, but the deep infrastructure of human connection and mutual care. And when the boom collapsed, when the grand plans crumbled, when the easy money disappeared, these foundations remained. They were what allowed Florida to rebuild, not as a speculative fantasy, but as a real place where real people could live real lives. Let us turn our attention now to the natural world, and to the ways that the Florida ecosystem responded to and recovered from the disruptions of the boom years. The great blue herons that nested in the mangroves of Biscayne Bay had no understanding of property values or investment opportunities. But they understood perfectly when their nesting areas were destroyed and to make room for development. During the peak boom years, thousands of acres of mangrove swamps were filled in or cut down. The developers saw these areas as wasteland, unproductive spaces that could be transformed into valuable waterfront property. But the mangroves were far from unproductive. They were nurseries where juvenile fish grew to adulthood. They were barriers that protected the coastline from storm surge. They were filtering systems that kept the coastal waters clean and clear. The herons and the fish and the other creatures that depended on these ecosystems had to adapt quickly. Some species moved to areas that were still undisturbed. Others changed their feeding and nesting patterns. A few simply disappeared from areas where they had lived for thousands of years. When the boom collapsed, when the construction stopped, when many developments were abandoned, nature began the slow work of reclamation. Mangrove seedlings took root in the shallow waters around abandoned docks. Vines grew over concrete foundations that were never built upon. Birds returned to areas that had been briefly disturbed but not permanently developed. It wasn't a complete recovery. Some changes were irreversible. Some species never returned. Some natural areas were lost forever. But nature proved to be more resilient than the economic systems that had temporarily dominated it. Given time and space, life found ways to adapt and recover and continue. The hurricanes of 1926 and 1928, which had seemed like disasters to human observers, were actually part of the natural rhythm of South Florida ecosystems. These storms had been reshaping the coastline for millennia, creating and destroying barrier islands, depositing sand and sediment, renewing and refreshing the coastal environments. The human developments that worked with these natural patterns, that accepted flooding as part of life near the water, survived better than those that tried to fight against the fundamental realities of living in a hurricane zone. And slowly, over the decades that followed, humans began to learn these lessons. To understand that development in Florida required a different approach than development in places with more stable climates and geology. Buildings began to be designed to bend rather than break in hurricane winds. Communities began to preserve more green space and natural drainage areas. Regulations began to protect the remaining mangroves and wetlands. Not perfectly, not completely, but gradually, with the hard-won wisdom that comes from experience. In the 1930s, as Florida slowly recovered from the boom and bust, a new kind of visitor began to arrive. Not investors looking for quick profits, but artists and writers drawn by the quality of light and the strangeness of the landscape. They came to paint the colors that didn't exist anywhere else. The particular blue of tropical water, the intense green of plants that grew year-round, the spectacular sunsets that painted the sky in shades that seemed almost artificial to eyes accustomed to northern latitudes. They came to write about a place that was still new enough to be surprising, where alligators sunned themselves in suburban canals, where orange groves grew next to downtown districts, where the boundary between civilization and wilderness was still fluid and uncertain. These artists and writers weren't interested in Florida as an investment opportunity. They were interested in it as a place unlike any other, a place that challenged their assumptions about what America could look like. Their paintings and poems and stories began to create a different image of Florida. Not paradise for sale, but a complex and fascinating place with its own character and its own stories. They painted the abandoned developments as haunting landscapes, places where human ambition met natural indifference and created something unexpectedly beautiful. They wrote about the resilience of both the people and the ecosystems that had survived the boom and bust. And gradually, these artistic visions began to influence how Florida saw itself, not just as a place to make money, but as a place worth preserving, worth understanding, worth treating with respect. This cultural shift was as important as any economic recovery. It helped create a foundation for more sustainable development. Development that took into account the unique qualities of the place rather than trying to impose alien patterns on a landscape that had its own logic and its own requirements. The children who grew up during the boom years carried their own memories into adulthood. For them, the wild speculation and sudden collapse weren't history. They were childhood experiences that shaped their understanding of the world. Some of these children grew up to be cautious adults, deeply skeptical of any investment opportunity that promised easy money. They remembered the anxiety in their parents' voices during the bust years. They remembered moving from house to house as fortunes appeared and disappeared. But other children drew different lessons from their experiences. They remembered the excitement of living in a place where anything seemed possible. They remembered the sense that they were witnessing the creation of something entirely new. These children grew up to be the civic leaders and business owners who rebuilt Florida in the decades after the bust. They had seen both the dangers of unchecked speculation and the possibilities that existed in a place where the old rules didn't necessarily apply. They learned to dream big but plan carefully, to embrace innovation while respecting natural limits, to welcome growth while protecting the qualities that made Florida distinctive. This generation, the children of the boom, became the architects of modern Florida. They built the universities and museums and parks that gave the state cultural depth to match its economic growth. They established the environmental protections that preserved something of the wild Florida their grandparents had known. They created a version of paradise that was more sustainable than the one their parents had tried to buy and sell. As the decades passed, the Florida land boom became something approaching mythology. The stories grew in the telling. The fortunes lost became larger. The developments planned became more fantastic. The crash became more dramatic. But beneath the mythology, the real lessons remained. Lessons about the relationship between hope and prudence, between vision and implementation, between individual dreams and community needs. These lessons influenced not just Florida, but the entire American approach to real estate development. The regulations put in place after the bust became models for other states. The planning techniques developed to prevent future speculative bubbles spread throughout the country. And when new booms arose, as they inevitably did, people had a reference point, a way to distinguish between legitimate growth and dangerous speculation, between sustainable development and bubble economics. Not that the lessons prevented all future bubbles. Human nature hasn't changed. The desire to get rich quick, the willingness to believe in easy solutions, the tendency to think that this time is different. These remain constant across generations. But the Florida land boom provided a vocabulary for understanding these phenomena, a way to recognize the warning signs, a historical precedent that could be studied and learned from. And sometimes, just sometimes, that was enough to help people make wiser choices. Today, if you drive along the Dixie Highway through the area where Flagler City was once planned, you'll pass through landscapes that tell layered stories. There are still traces of the original survey lines, still sections of that concrete curbing that marked the boundaries of lots that were never built upon, still the occasional street sign that leads nowhere, pointing toward developments that never developed. But there are also thriving communities that grew up around the bones of boom-era plans, towns that took the infrastructure left behind by failed developments and built something real and lasting on those foundations. There are parks where children play on land that was once marked out for luxury hotels. There are nature preserves where endangered species find refuge in areas that were once surveyed for subdivision. There are small farms where families grow the kinds of crops that K.W. Lord demonstrated on his model farm, proving that his vision of Florida agriculture was sound even when the real estate speculation that funded it was not. These contemporary landscapes represent a kind of redemption, not a denial of the boom years or the bust that followed, but a transformation of that history into something useful and beautiful. The dreams didn't disappear. They evolved. They became more realistic and more sustainable, but they retained something of the original vision. The sense that Florida could be a place where people created new ways of living. The great teaching of the Florida land boom is not that dreams are dangerous. It's that dreams need to be grounded in reality to become sustainable. The people who lost money during the bust weren't foolish for dreaming. They were human for hoping. Their mistake was in confusing speculation with building, publicity with value, the appearance of paradise with its reality. But their dreams contained real insights. Florida really could be a place where people escaped harsh winters. It really could support communities that were more connected to the natural world than the industrial cities of the north. It really could offer new ways of organizing social and economic life. The tragedy was not in the dreaming, but in the methods, in trying to create paradise through speculation rather than through the patient work of community building, in expecting instant results rather than accepting the slow process of sustainable development, in forgetting that real paradise, if such a thing exists, can't be bought and sold. It can only be created through the accumulated efforts of people who care more about building something lasting than about making a quick profit. This is perhaps why some of the boom-era developments survived and thrived while others disappeared entirely. The ones that lasted were built by people who genuinely cared about creating beautiful, livable communities. The ones that failed were built by people who cared primarily about selling lots to other people. The difference wasn't always visible in the marketing materials. Both types of development used similar language, similar promises, similar appeals to the dream of tropical paradise. But the difference was real, and over time, it made all the difference between communities that became home to real families and communities that remained forever incomplete. Concrete shells waiting for a life that never came. As our story draws toward its close, let us spend a few moments in quiet contemplation of time itself, of the way that years and decades transform even the most dramatic events into gentle memories. The Florida land boom that seemed so urgent and overwhelming to the people living through it now exists primarily in books and photographs, and the stories that elderly residents tell their grandchildren. The fortunes that were won and lost, that seemed so important at the time, are now just numbers in historical accounts. The people who made and lost those fortunes have long since turned to dust beneath the palm trees they planted or failed to plant. But other things from that era have proved more durable than money. The parks and gardens that were created during the boom years still provide beauty and recreation for contemporary residents. The architectural styles that emerged from the boom years still influence how buildings are designed in South Florida. The cultural institutions that were established with boom-era money still serve their communities. The environmental lessons learned from boom-era mistakes still guide conservation efforts. And the stories. The human stories of hope and disappointment, of ambition and wisdom, of loss and recovery. These stories continue to resonate because they speak to experiences that every generation faces in some form. Every generation has its own version of the Florida land boom, its own moment when new technologies or social changes create the illusion that the old rules no longer apply. Its own bubble of excessive optimism, followed by the inevitable crash of reality. And every generation has the opportunity to learn from the experiences of those who came before, to distinguish between genuine innovation and mere speculation, between sustainable progress and unsustainable exuberance. The specific details change. The underlying human dynamics remain remarkably consistent. Which is why stories like the Florida land boom never really end. They just begin again in different forms, in different places, with different players acting out the same eternal drama of hope and fear, vision and blindness, boom and bust. But perhaps that's enough analysis for one evening. Perhaps it's time to let the story simply exist as story, to let the images and voices and gentle lessons settle into the quiet spaces of memory where the best stories live. Imagine one more time that concrete curbing stretching through the Florida wilderness. 4 miles of human intention preserved in an environment that has moved on to other purposes. Imagine the morning glories that climb those concrete barriers now. The lizards that sun themselves on the warm surfaces. The birds that perch on the surveyor's stakes and sing songs that have nothing to do with property values or investment returns. Imagine the way the morning light filters through Spanish moss and palm fronds to illuminate these abandoned fragments of the American dream. Not sadly, but peacefully, as if the earth itself has forgiven the temporary madness of speculation and absorbed it into something larger and more enduring. This too is a kind of paradise. Not the paradise that was advertised in Times Square billboards or promised in glossy brochures, but a quieter paradise that emerges when human ambition and natural patience find ways to coexist. A paradise that teaches us that some of our greatest failures can become, given enough time, some of our most beautiful successes. Not in the ways we planned, but in ways that are sometimes better than anything we could have planned. Ways that include room for both dreams and reality, for both human hopes and natural wisdom, for both the excitement of possibility and the peace of acceptance. Sleep now. Let the story find its rest in the space between memory and forgetting. Let the voices of the land boom era fade into the larger chorus of all the people who have ever hoped for something better than what they had. Let the concrete curbing of Flagler City become part of your dreams, not as a symbol of failure, but as a reminder that even our incomplete efforts to create beauty and meaning leave traces that can be transformed into something useful by those who come after us. Let the morning glories climb through your sleep, connecting the broken fragments of human intention into patterns more lovely than anything their creators originally envisioned. And when you wake tomorrow morning, whether in Florida or Ohio or anywhere else, remember that paradise is not a place you can buy. It's a way of seeing the place where you already are. Good night from the land where dreams grow wild among the palm trees. Good night from the place where the morning glories climb the remnants of Flagler City. Good night from Florida, where it's always June in the hearts of those who have learned to appreciate both the beauty and the fragility of all human dreams.